So good evening, all, and welcome to the George T. Scanlon Graduate Student Award in Arab and Islamic Civilizations. We're here to celebrate the memory and legacy of Professor Scanlon and to recognize excellence in graduate level scholarship in the Department of Arab and Islamic Civilizations, or ERIC as we like to refer to it as. We're all grateful to you gathering here tonight, and we're grateful to those who are participating remotely for joining us on this special occasion. And thanks also to the many people who helped prepare this evening's event. Among them, I would like to mention our department's Director of Graduate Studies, Amina El-Bandari. Thank you, Amina. Our department's selection committee, which consisted of Drs. Bernard O'Kane, Mohammed Sirag, and Eleanor Fernandez. Our executive assistant, Marwa Sabri, and numerous people behind the scenes who have helped with organizing, advertising, and technical support. At this time, if you've not already done so, I might ask you to take a moment to pull out your mobile phone and put it on silent. Before proceeding further, I have a couple of announcements that I'd like to make. Unfortunately, our scheduled keynote speaker, Dr. Tarek Swalem, has taken ill and is unable to be with us this evening. We wish him well and send him healing thoughts and prayers his way. We're deeply grateful to Dr. Bernard O'Kane, who's generously agreed to share his recent research with us in Tarek's place. This year's award recipient is abroad, so he will be sharing his presentation as a recorded video and has delegated a colleague to accept the award on his behalf. First, a word about George T. Scanlon. Globally, Professor Scanlon is perhaps best known for his seminal archaeological fieldwork at Fustat, begun several years before he joined AUC in 1974. From then until his retirement, which I believe was in 2010, he taught Islamic art and architecture and engaged deeply in university service. Professor Scanlon is one of the rare people whose influence on the lives he touched was so generative that his legacy expands rather than fades as time passes. The Department of Arab and Islamic Civilizations is very proud of the Scanlon Award. Proud, of course, because it honors an esteemed faculty member from our own department, and proud because the prize itself reflects the vision, the initiative, and the perseverance of alumni from our own department. A dedicated group of Professor Scanlon's former students, advisees, and mentees. Starting in 2014, I think, this group collaborated in a fundraising campaign and established the Endowed Award that we are celebrating today. We continue to develop this fund and encourage those interested in contributing to consult the brochure for details about ways to give. Because there's still room for growth in this endowment. We have to give it a little nudge. Every year, a selection committee for the George T. Scanlon Graduate Award in Arab and Islamic Civilizations convenes and pores over recently submitted department theses to select the most distinguished among them. And this year's selection committee, which as I mentioned, was composed of Bernard O'Kane as committee chair, Dr. Mohammed Sirag, and Dr. Eleanor Fernandez, unanimously agreed that the recipient of the 2023 award should be Nabil Haskan-Bansha for his excellent thesis supervised by Dr. Mohammed Sirag. Nabil's close study of the debates on Al-Kashaf offers a more holistic understanding of the text's genre and greater appreciation of its intersectionality with other fields of Islamic science. Suddenly, I have the light, than has been generally received. We're delighted to share also that Nabil has been accepted at the University of Toronto to continue his studies at the doctoral level. At this time, I would like to invite the Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Dean John Malloy, to present the award, which will be received by a colleague of Nabil's, Abdel Halim bin Mohammed, in Nabil's absence. So, Abdel Halim, Dean Malloy, please. We hope that we would now be hearing from Nabil himself, I hope, in the form of a video recording in which Nabil will share the high points of his research presentation. And after that, I'll introduce our keynote talk.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nabil Haskan Bensha, and I will be speaking about my thesis, which is an analysis of the Ash'ari-Mu'tazila conflict in the Hashia of Ibn al-Munayyah and al-Kashaf. So the primary text which I focused on for my thesis is called Tafsir al-Kashaf. It is written by Zamakhshari, prominent Islamic scholar, a poet, grammarian, theologian from the 12th century. And his Tafsir al-Kashaf is known to be very controversial because it contains Mu'tazila elements from the Mu'tazila theology. However, it's still very popular today, studied by many students of Islamic studies due to its heavy focus on Arabic grammar, Arabic rhetoric, when interpreting Quranic verses. And this Arabic section that I have here is taken from the introduction of Al-Kashaf. It states that Al-Kashaf is the best of tafsir from the aspect of Arabic rhetoric, despite its Mu'tazila influences, and many of the tafsirs would refer and take from Al-Kashaf to some extent. And when it comes to Arabic grammar, Arabic rhetoric and tafsir, no one can do it like Zamakhshari, the way how he unravels the beauty of the Quran and the hidden gems through using Arabic grammar. And since Al-Kashaf is the primary text, I'll be taking a closer look at the margins, the gloss commentary in Al-Kashaf, which is located right beneath the main text. So we have the main text, and right underneath we would have the gloss commentary. And this gloss commentary is written by Ibn al-Munayyah, who is a judge from Alexandria, Egypt, from the 13th century. So this after 1 century of Al-Kashaf being circulated, we have the first written response by Ibn al-Munayyah. It's very important for us to consider this gloss commentary because we have on one end, we have the Mu'tazila, the unorthodox camp by Zamakhshari, and on the other hand, we have Ibn al-Munayyah, who represents the staunch Ash'ari conservative camp. So to understand further the divide between the Mu'tazila and the Ash'ari camp in tafsir, we can take a closer look at Al-Kashaf. So what are some of the motivations behind my thesis? Well, I would like to understand the elements of tafsir. What is a Mu'tazila tafsir? What do you gain from reading different types of tafsir? There is unanimous consensus that the Quran is one. However, there are many interpretations of the Quran, and I would like to understand how does a Mu'tazila tafsir differ from an orthodox traditional tafsir text. For my next point, I would want to know the importance of the Hashia, the gloss commentary in tafsir. What does the Hashia tell us about the Mu'tazila ideas in Al-Kashaf, and how do we understand the reception of Al-Kashaf through the gloss commentary? For my next point, I also would like to appreciate the ingenuity of Zamakhshari and Ibn al-Munayyah, both of these scholars, the way how they address each argument, how they form opinions, explanations, because they would approach it from multiple angles. They would sometimes explain through a grammatical angle, and other times philosophical or theological position. So there are many layers to their explanation, and it's very interesting to examine them. For my next point, I would also like to understand, appreciate the intersection of tafsir, hadith, and fiqh. Many people, when we talk about tafsir, they usually isolate it. They treat tafsir as its own genre. However, after closely looking at Al-Qishna, it is important that we consider different Islamic sciences, tafsir, hadith, and fiqh, in order to understand and study Al-Qishna holistically. Some of the main questions which I need to answer: what extent does Ibn al-Munayr refute al-Zamakhshari in his gloss commentary? What does the gloss commentary, the Hashia, tell us about the Mu'tazila principles in Al-Kashaf? In what areas of topics do we find Ibn al-Munayr agree with al-Zamakhshari? What are some of the primary hermeneutical principles used to guide exegetes in Quran commentary? So these are the main questions which I will aim to answer in my thesis. The significance. Well, the Hashia, the gloss commentary, is needed to fully understand the theological context of Kashaf, because it reveals the intersection of theology and theology by considering the various exegetical tools used to interpret the Quran. And what do I mean when I say traditional exegetical tools? Well, these include tafsir, the Quran, so using the Quran to explain other verses from the Quran, using grammar, questions and answers, varying readings, occasions of revelation, and prophetic narrations, as well as poetry. So just as I mentioned earlier, both of these scholars, they would rely on these tools, and therefore their explanations would come from different angles. Sometimes we will see a theological explanation, grammatical, and philosophical angle. So with that being said, I just want to emphasize that tafsir is a dynamic genre. It should not be isolated from other sciences. After seeing how they rely on different tools, which is not only limited to the tafsir genre. As for the literature review, this forms the theoretical framework for my thesis. I start off by emphasizing that the tafsir tradition, it engages with other disciplines. It's not dichotomous, as many people have seen. People like to treat it in black and white. There is tafsir bil-ra'i, which is tafsir by reasoning, and tafsir bil-maqtul, tafsir by tradition. And people would often categorize it within these two groups. However, it's much more complicated than that. And at many times, there's a lot of overlapping between these two groups. So looking at the works of other scholars, we have Norman Calder here suggests studying commentary by examining its instrumental structures and ideological structures, which includes prophetic history, theology, and law. And I support this position because it distances us from seeing tafsir in black and white. Once we bring theology in, we have to consider the nuances in beliefs, and that's when we start seeing how rich the tradition is. And for the next point, Suleiman Murad states that tafsir, the genre of tafsir, is a battlefield where the exegete fights his opponents over their misinterpretation of scripture. It is not a passive process in which the exegete simply proposes the meanings of the Quranic verses. And this is another point which I strongly support because many people see tafsir to be static and stagnant. It is a genre that is not changing and has not changed for a long time. Of course, this is not true because we have scholars who constantly add to the tradition. And we see this with the next point earlier. Scholars started the process and offered their opinions, and the later ones must complement and complete that by perfecting the study of the Quran. So in the early generations, the scholars, they started studying, they gave their interpretations, and the new generation of scholars came, then they would add to that or modify it entirely. Walid Saleh, he also states something very similar. He talked about the genealogical tradition, describing that the tafsir genre depends on material inherited from earlier exegetes, also known as the inherited. So all in all, we see that tafsir is changing. It doesn't stay the same as people expect. There are scholars who formulated their opinions. The later scholars came, they would modify from it. And this is interesting as we look at Kashaf, we see a Mu'tazila commentary, and then we would see Orthodox Sunni scholars who came after Kashaf, adding to it, modifying it, explaining it, clarifying it. And in this case, the example of my gloss commentary, Ibn Munayya, who tries to explain, refute some of the ideas in Al-Kashaf. So after looking at the literature review, this has helped me a lot in terms of formulating the main methodology for my thesis. And I prioritize looking at all of this from a holistic approach where I consider the theological, grammatical, and philosophical angles. And how do I exactly do this? Well, to unpack the Mu'tazila elements in Al-Kashaf, I would have to look at the 5 principles of Mu'tazila theology. Looking at these 5 principles, I would take Quranic verses, which conform or are often quoted by Mu'tazila theologians. So these 5 principles include divine unity, tawheed, justice, and unity, adl, and the warning and the promise, al-wa'id wal-wa'id, the intermediary position, al-manzila, bayn al-manzilatin, commanding good and prohibiting evil, al-amr bil-ma'ruf wal-nahy anil munkar. Another important principle stated by Norman Fogel, the synchronic principle requires the text to be justifiable to revelation, while the diachronic principle requires that participants in the school tradition, whether Sunni or Shi'i, preserve loyalty to the tradition by taking into account the interpretive achievement of older masters. So both of these principles are very relevant to my thesis, as on one hand I showed that as a Makhshari, as a Mu'tazila would want to interpret verses in a way which conforms to his Mu'tazila beliefs. And conversely, we would have Ibn Munayya, who is an Ash'ari, he would want to interpret the verses using the same tools, however, to support his Ash'ari beliefs. And from looking at their interpretations, it is not correct to claim that Ibn Munayya rejects Al-Kashaf in its entirety. He only rejects the Mu'tazila content in Al-Kashaf and other sections which are more neutral or do not contradict his Ash'ari beliefs. He has no problem accepting them. So for my main arguments and findings, Ibn al-Munayya, first Ash'ari scholar to critique Al-Kashaf, he criticizes the Mu'tazila contents which I mentioned, but praises it from a grammatical and rhetorical perspective. And the Mu'tazila works in Al-Kashaf, it's perceived to be unorthodox, heretical, because they deviate from the traditional exegetical authorities, including the traditions of Prophet Muhammad and early experts. Yet I notice and observe that these disagreements are only limited to theological topics, and therefore my thesis argues that Ibn al-Munayya only refuses Makhshari on theological matters. In other matters, grammar, rhetoric syntax, prophetic tradition, both authors agree with each other and interpret verses according to the exegetical tools employed in the tafsir genre. So we see compromise in reconciliation between both sides. They don't fully reject each other. At times we see them agreeing, and sometimes we see them disagreeing. It depends on the content. And I would add that Al-Kashaf is a Mu'tazila Quran commentary, but at the same time it's traditional, as it still uses many of the traditional tools that I listed earlier. So poetry, grammar, prophetic tradition, hadith, these are all tools used in other traditional tafsir texts, and we also see them in Al-Kashaf. So conclusion, as I said, both agree and disagree depending on the theological controversy, and I would like to give an example of the vision of God. As Zamakhshari on one hand says that it's impossible for believers to see God, and then Ibn al-Munayya would clarify this position, saying that it's impossible to see God now, but in the hereafter, the believers will be able to see God. So it's not a full rejection of Zamakhshari's ideas. It's just explaining, clarifying them in a way which does not contradict the Ash'ari beliefs. For my future studies, I realized that this is not a comprehensive analysis of Kashaf, but it would be great for later scholars to come along and look at other texts related to Al-Kashaf. For example, Al-Tahdhib al-Tafsir, there are many other scholars have stated as Zamakhshari may have taken from this book. Many of his opinions may have been formed by the Tafsir, and then we can also look at other scholars who came after Al-Kashaf, other Sunni scholars, other gloss commentaries, such as the Hashiyah of al-Tibi on Al-Kashaf. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and hope you all have a wonderful evening.
So this evening's pinch-hitting keynote speaker is another source of tremendous pride for for the Eric Department, as he is one of our own faculty members, Professor of Islamic Art and Architecture, Dr. Bernard O'Kane. For most of us gathered here, Dr. O'Kane needs no introduction. In addition to having taught at AUC since 1980, he has been a visiting professor at Harvard University and the University of California at Berkeley. Dr. O'Kane is the author of several books, including The Mosques of Egypt, The Illustrated Guide to the Museum of Islamic Art in Cairo, Timurid Architecture in Khorasan, and Mosques, the 100 Most Iconic Islamic Houses of Worship. Dr. O'Kane's research interests include Iranian art and architecture, Egyptian Islamic art and architecture, Islamic epigraphy, and Islamic tile work. He also directed the creation of the Monumental Inscriptions of Cairo, an online database featuring searchable and translated transcriptions of epigraphy on Cairo's historic monuments. His lecture this evening, entitled The Role of the Architect in Designing for Women in the Mosque, reflects the many synergies reverberating between the history of architecture, Islamic studies, gender studies, and architectural design. Please join me in welcoming Dr. O'Kane.
Thank you very much for that introduction. My late colleague was notorious for blaming all of the ills on this country on the Muslim women of Egypt. So were he able to read the title of the lecture, he might be spinning in his grave, but that's a risk we'll have to take. The sight of tens of thousands of Muslims circumambulating the Haram in Mecca has long been an inspiring one. The culmination of a lifetime's dream for many, it may be surprising to some of them that there's no gender separation for the pilgrims within this space. This has remained as it was from the days of the Prophet Muhammad, a situation that was also apparent at the same time at the Mosque of the Prophet at Medina, as attested by numerous hadith. When then did the issue of women praying in mosques and the related issue of segregated spaces for women in mosques become issues for Muslim society? Despite the Prophet's admonition, do not forbid the maidservants of God from going to the mosques of God, jurists in the centuries after the death of the Prophet ruled on ways in which women's participation in public prayer could be circumscribed. But there's also a whole range of sources with references to women's participation in public prayer in pre-modern times in the Maghreb, Egypt and Syria, Iraq, in Ottoman Istanbul, showing how, despite the restrictions imposed by jurists, women's admission to mosques, whether participating in Friday prayers or for private prayers for instruction, was normal. So the situation at the Mosque of the Prophet of Medina was just that everybody would line up in rows, possibly with the women behind the men. Now, the issue that is going to become apparent as the talk goes on is one of accession to some of the greatest spaces that we have in Islamic architecture. So I'm just going to give you a very quick run through of some of the various types that we have and which I think are visually extremely inspiring. Like the hypostyle mosque, we have one of the finest examples in the world in the Mosque of Ibn Tulun here in Cairo. A plan composed of many columns, that's what hypostyle means, which gives you magnificent vistas through the arcades. We also have another wonderful example of this in the Great Mosque of Cordoba, subsequently turned into a cathedral, but there are still lots of magnificent vistas that you have through the hypostyle areas. Yeah, there is a laser pointer here, but this magnificent screen is so bright that it doesn't show up, so forget about the pointer. But yes, the vistas through the diminishing arcades are equally apparent in this wonderful building. Another type of structure that became popular from the 12th century onwards is that of the domed prayer hall in a 4-Iwan courtyard, as exemplified by many of the mosques of Iran, in particular the Friday Mosque of Isfahan, whose Qibla dome chamber was inserted into the hypostyle space in the 1080s. And very shortly afterwards, probably the 4 Iwans were added to the hypostyle courtyard. We have a magnificent example, of course, of it also in Cairo, one of the greatest buildings in the world, not just the Islamic world, the complex of Sultan Hassan, with its 4 Iwan courtyard here, visible from the view from the minaret. And it has the largest single Iwan in Cairo and certainly one of the largest in the world, whose scaffolding, Makrizi tells us, would have provided the funds to build a small mosque on its own. We have simply single dome mosques, which are equally worthy of aesthetic attention, such as the Sheikh Lutfallah Mosque in Isfahan, dating from the early 17th century, with its magnificent tilework. And in the Ottoman tradition in particular, the emphasis upon the dome became particularly important, beginning perhaps with the Uch Shirafeli Mosque in Edirne from the middle of the 15th century, carrying on to the culmination perhaps in the Selimiya Mosque in the 16th century, also in the city of Edirne, with these magnificent series of windows letting natural light into the interior, as well as the artificial light on the polycandle that you can see. Some scholars have suggested that it was in the Ottoman period, as in the Sultan Ahmad Mosque, the Blue Mosque in Tabriz from the early 17th century, that we begin to get balconies on the upper floor, such as this one, which were set aside for women. But in fact, I have my doubts about this theory, and others have noted that this is really mostly the entrance to the Sultan's Loge, the space that was set aside for the royal family in particular. Some others have suggested perhaps in the Friday Mosque of Yazd, dating from the 14th century, that the upper balconies here may have been used for women. In fact, there's no direct evidence for this from the sources, and exactly what these upper galleries were used for is still something of a mystery. Some other earlier commentators suggested that some of the balconies we find in mosques in Egypt as well, such as the Mosque of Anas Muhammad on the Citadel. It has this little balcony at the rear, but it wouldn't have held many women. There's a tiny little ladder leading up to it. So the idea, I think, of Doris Behrens, I would say that this was the Dikkat al-Muezzin for the Iqam, or the call to prayer inside the mosque, is the most likely explanation. So what sort of, when in fact did spaces for women become apparent in mosque buildings? I think probably that it happened after the middle of the 20th century. There still has to be a study done, which would be very interesting, to show what were the ideological underpinnings of this change and where it occurred in different parts of the world, and comparing the different rates of change. That hasn't been done yet. So I'm just providing some preliminary observations here. One of the easiest ways, of course, to affect a space is to curtain it off, and that's what's seen in many mosques in Cairo, for instance. I've seen it. It's also apparent in many mosques in Malaysia. This is the Selangor National Mosque in one of the states in Malaysia, an unusual 9-sided building from the second half of the 20th century, which has a series of balconies on the upper stories you can see with wooden partitions. This initially, I think, was designed for women, but in fact, on my recent visit, I also saw that there was a separate wooden screen on the lower floor. And in fact, in Malaysia, the situation has become rather fluent, it seems. There are many mosques with upper balconies. This is the Iron Mosque from the 20th century in Putrajaya. Another example, the Shah Alam Mosque near Kuala Lumpur has upper balconies. And these ones with the upper balconies were primarily designed for women, but there's been, I understand from some Malaysian colleagues, a government decree that there should be lifts available for those with disabilities to be able to access these spaces. And there's been some flexibility with local mosque committees to provide for women praying at the back. This is one of the most exciting mosques in recent times, the Sancaklar Mosque, just west of Istanbul from the 21st century. The main building is actually underground. This is a view of the prayer hall with a kind of adumbrated dome within it. Now looking from the other direction where that wow in the distance, short for Hua, there is, well, actually there's a view of the plan. On the left-hand side here is the women's partition. And I must say, when I saw this, I thought that's a rather miserable little space given the size of the building. This is a photograph from the original architect's drawings with a rather nice perforated screen in the distance. Time of my visit, that had been replaced by this much more solid screen, which rather dismayed me until, fortunately, I was able at the Hozan Award for Architecture conference in Kuwait recently to speak with the architect, Emre Aralat, who told me that some women asked for a private space for prayer within the building. So it's not always what it seems at first sight. And this was specifically at the request of the women. He also told me that many women pray in rows behind the men in the main space of the mosque, and that the men don't have any objection to this. Another possibility is to put a women's balcony, but is sort of self-contained at the back of the building. This is the Al Capita Mosque, 2009 in Bahrain. And looking from the Qibla area upwards, you can see the women's balcony there. That's another view of it with the open spaces down below visible. And this might have been selected because it's a very convenient way of saving space on the left-hand side. You can see that the ablutions area is right underneath the space where the women's balcony is on the upper story. But the problem with this is it's a fairly restricted space at ground level, which means that it looks a little bit claustrophobic, I think, because of the intrusion of this women's balcony into the main prayer hall. And that, to a certain extent, applies in the Juma Mosque in Musharraf in Qatar. We see the outside here, and the women's balcony, which has this lovely perforated metal screen on the upper story. It gives the women a good view of the inside. It's supported on these thin columns, as you can see in the bottom. But the women's gain here is the men's loss. You can see it if you're praying at the bottom of this area. In fact, the vista that you have of the mihrab is rather limited now. One of the most magnificent recent mosques is fortunately one that we have in Egypt, the Basuna Mosque of Walid Arafah. It's a single dome chamber. And again, when I first saw it, this is the outside. The women's balcony you can see in the left-hand side here. On the right-hand side, that's the view of the mihrab. I thought that's, again, rather a limited space for women, not really what I would have expected. And this is the view from the women's balcony, not terribly open. But again, here I had the good fortune of speaking to the architect, who told me that initially, Basuna is a very small village mosque in Upper Egypt. the men of the village didn't want women to pray at all in the space. So in fact, this is quite a nice compromise. They are able to pray without being seen, and it's a private space which enables them to participate in public prayers. Some interesting recent mosques in Turkey have been the Shakarin Mosque, for instance, 21st century in Istanbul, which has an interior that won a lot of fame because it was designed by a woman. Although it's unclear to me whether the woman's balcony that you see in the background was designed by the initial architect, a man, Husrev Taylor, before the woman became involved. But it is a nice open space, certainly. There's another new mosque also in Istanbul, the Yeşil Vadi, in the form of two half domes of slightly different sizes. And when I went there, it was interesting because obviously the women's balcony is the one that you see in the upper story here. But when I got there, the perforated wooden screen that you see in the bottom right is where the women were praying. They were behind there, confined there with their children. And I thought, well, that's a bit of a swizz. So fortunately here again, I was able to enter into correspondence with the architect, who told me that indeed the upper space was initially designed as a space for women's prayer. But later on, presumably the authorities in charge of organizing the space there decided that it was too good for the women, so they moved them down. Another approach is to divide the horizontal space of a prayer hall in front of the Qibla area, which is seen in a few mosques, such as the Ghadir Mosque in Tehran, which won the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. It has a magnificent dome chamber, brick decorated with tile in a traditional manner. That's the mihrab in the middle. The plan shows you here that the prayer hall that is on the right-hand side of the dome chamber here is divided vertically into two spaces, the upper one for the women, the lower for the men. But the balcony that you see in the right-hand side, which is closed off with a curtain, that's in fact what leads to the women's prayer hall. So unfortunately, they're missing the wonderful view that the men have of this magnificent dome chamber. This is the Penzberg Mosque. It's a town south of Munich that was built in the 21st century, which has roughly the same plan. It has this wonderful transparent Qibla wall that you see in the right-hand side, as well as this magnificent calligraphic minaret. The plan, as you can see, is of a prayer hall that has 4 columns supporting an upper level. We're looking down from the upper level towards the mihrab on the inside here. And here's the view from the mihrab looking backwards. We see the lower men's prayer hall, the upper women's space. Again, the view from the back of the men's space, in fact, is rather claustrophobic. And this is a feature that we find too in a controversial recent mosque in Tehran, the Vali Asr Mosque, which also has an upper balcony with a women's prayer hall. But if you look from the Qibla backwards, you can see that the women's gain here, which has some natural light at the top, sorry, let me go back, is the men's loss. It's rather cramped in comparison. In fact, sadly, this is a building that is so controversial that the religious authorities in Tehran have not let it be used as a place of worship because it doesn't have a minaret or a dome. So there you go. But at least in these spaces, the architect did design separate enclosures, especially for women. You can contrast this with the Imam Hassan Mosque in Heliopolis, one of the rather good examples of a modern neo-Mamluk design, which has a very attractive interior space, typical sort of one dome with 4 columns supporting it. Where do the women pray? Salah Nisa in the basement. Whether this was intended by the architect, I doubt somehow. I hope not anyway, but it's rather miserable in comparison. Here's another possible route by which you can design space for women, and that is a totally separate prayer hall, which we see in many modern state mosques, particularly in the Gulf. such as the main mosque in Bahrain, for instance, the Al Fatah Mosque. Looking at it first, we see a balcony around three sides of the prayer hall, which when I first saw it, I assumed, okay, this must be the women's space. But then on the left-hand side in pink, on the right of the left-hand slide, you can see the female prayer hall. It's a much smaller space in comparison with the much larger main prayer hall for the men. And that's the view of it again, rather underwhelming, shall we say, in comparison with the men's example. This is also the case in the State Mosque of Oman, designed by Mohammed Mackay, the Iraqi architect. The that you see at the base, which is rather different from the grander entrance on the left-hand side to the men's prayer hall. The one on the right is to the women's prayer hall. This is the view of the men's prayer hall, much grander than that available to the women. And it's rather similar in the mosque that the same architect, Mohammed Mackay, designed for Kuwait City. It's also one on the same plan, basically a large prayer hall with a dome supported by 4 columns. The women's prayer hall overlooks the main prayer hall, which has recently been Disneyfied and redecorated in a different style from the original. This is what the original looked like. That's the mihrab on the back. The view looking backwards from that originally shows you the women's gallery on the right-hand side there. In fact, it's really rather almost totally closed off with the view of the mosque, and that's the interior of the women's gallery in the Kuwait Mosque. Same architect did one in Doha as well. Very similar type of plan. That's the view of the mihrab, the view back towards the wooden screens which totally separate the women's prayer hall from the main mosque. And one of the most famous modern mosques, of course, is the Arabian Nights, shall we say, style Sheikh Zayed Mosque in Abu Dhabi, which has certainly colossal amounts of space within it, but the numbers 3 in this plan, as opposed to the numbers 4, are the women's prayer halls, quite a bit smaller than the main prayer hall, which even if you don't find it as overdone as I do, it's certainly in terms of space volumetric. This is the contrasting size of the women's prayer hall. So what sort of debates have been going on around this topic around the world? I mean, the most scholarly approach to the subject has been Marianne Katz's book on women in the mosque, which discusses the historical attitudes towards this. As you can see, it's had 2 printings, so it's been a popular book. We also, of course, have to see this in the context of debates that have been current from the late 19th century through the 20th into the 21st about the role of women within Islamic society. And of course, there have been many voices, not just women, calling for greater participation, greater influence, a more important position for women in Islamic society. There have been many specific critiques of the exclusion of women in the mosque, particularly from women in Muslim minority societies. And that's not too surprising, given that in those societies, the mosque performs much more of a role as a community center than it does in Muslim majority countries, where it's a place where families can meet together and establish ties that they wouldn't otherwise be able to. So this is by Zarqa Nawaz. She's the author of a sitcom, which is very popular, Little Mosque on the Prairie. So that's something that's worth having a look at. This is a YouTube video which she's done on this subject, which I can recommend. It's quite humorous. There are many other web pages that you could find that deal with this topic in great detail, in fact. So that's just one. Salma al-Wardani is a famous name in this respect. Another one is Miriam Iskandarani, who is an architect. And in fact, I was listening in on a webinar a few months ago at which she was participating. And she was asked in this how she dealt with the request for spaces for women in the mosque. And she said that, in fact, she advocates that there be no separate space for women in mosques, that they should be able to use the space equally. And she said that when clients asked why they should be so, she said, this was the case in the Prophet's Mosque in Medina. Why should it be any different now? So, yeah, the Islamic Society of North America is calling for more inclusivity for women, women-friendly mosques. There's a booklet that supports this in great detail that you can find online as well. There's an interesting book by the Egyptian scholar Tammy Gaber, who did her PhD in Cara University and now teaches in St. Laurentian University in Canada. And she's published this very interesting book called The Divide. The Divide is not only the divide between Muslims and non-Muslims in Canada, but also between men and women in mosques. She has a whole chapter on this particular topic in her book, very interestingly. And she has supported this very convincingly by these graphic illustrations of the spaces available for women in mosques, showing you the space in red contrasting with the space in gray for men. So in the vast majority of illustrations she gives, of course, the red is much smaller than the gray. There are a couple of examples in Charlottetown and in the Aga Khan Jamaat Khane in Toronto, where they're equal, but that's just a couple of a very small minority. And you can contrast this approach of Tammy Gaber in Canada to a book by a male author. And this is the space that he devotes to it in the whole of his book. It's not just in North America that Muslim women have been calling for change. They've been very vocal, in fact, in all parts of the Islamic world. Here are a few from Britain on the left-hand side. This book, Ibn Hazm and Lawfulness of Women Attending Prayers in Mosques, is by an author directed at an audience in Britain as well. I was surprised to find on the internet the web page of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin calling for the presence of women in the mosques. As you can see from the base, it says that women's presence in the mosque is normal at all times and on all occasions. So that was a nice surprise. There are also debates going on in Egypt. My colleague Nourhan Adel brought this debate to my notice on the left-hand side about women in a mosque near Fustat having been promised space at the back of the mosque with air conditioning being relegated to the basement. In Turkey as well, there are similar debates going on, as you can see from the article on the right-hand side. The same is happening in Malaysia, for instance, on the left-hand side, and also in India. The book is written in English, but it's directed at an Indian audience. And interestingly, when I talked first on this subject at the Fauzan Award for Architecture in Kuwait, in the abstracts of the mosque was this paper by an Egyptian colleague teaching in Leicester University on basically exactly the same topic. So it's become one of interest throughout the Islamic world at the moment. So with regard to some of the mosques that we've looked at today, I mentioned the Sanjak Lar and the Basuna. The interpretation of women's rights that I would have made at first glance had to be substantially revised after talking to the architect in each case. And it's also worth emphasizing that there will be different significant approaches to this matter in Muslim majority and Muslim minority countries. So given the religious isolation of Muslims from the surrounding community, in Muslim minority countries, the mosque plays a much more vital role. And indeed, female Muslims in those countries have been most vocal in arguing for removal of gender-separated barriers. But there are also indications from Muslim majority courses that some women feel that they should have more equal access to space in the mosques. One recent change in Muslim majority countries and elsewhere is the greater participation of women in architectural programs. This could be one reason why in the future this matter might receive more attention. In Turkey, it has been noted recently that women increased their visibility in mosque architectures as users, critics, and designers. And it can be argued that Muslim women, whether in Muslim majority or Muslim minority countries, miss out on a great deal if they're not permitted to view the interior spaces of mosques, old and new. The spatial qualities of mosque architecture are their most celebrated attributes. And for instance, let me give you a quote from one woman, as it happens from my hometown of Belfast, of all places, which gives you an indication of the depth of feeling that this subject arouses. Each Eid, I hope for better space, for more inclusion of women and children, and each year I come home bitterly disappointed and spiritually hurt. So it would be sad indeed if half of the Muslim population were denied these benefits. Even though there may not be unanimity in this topic, it seems that there is a groundswell worldwide from female Muslims, supported also by many male Muslims, for greater inclusivity in mosque spaces. Architects should at least be aware of some of the strategies available for this. This can range from complete equality to spacious areas that provide seamless oral and visual connection with the main prayer hall, including for those females who might prefer that, some more private space. And even if architects may not have a final say in this matter, persuasively raising the possibilities with clients is more likely to result in buildings that satisfy the needs and aspirations of the whole of the Muslim community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bernard. To whom can I pass the mic first? I'll stand here. Oh.
So thank you very much. This has been quite engaging, let's say, and I'm sure many of us will have a lot to think about. So I was wondering, it was interesting, this explanation that you attributed to Doris Abu Saif about the balconies in Ottoman mosques having been probably been created or designed as spaces for the royal family, or maybe perhaps like a maqsura for sultans rather than a place for women.
No,
I misunderstood.
No, they were designed as the Dikkat al-Muezzin.
Sorry, yes,
Yeah.
okay, I confused
For the
that.
Iqama, yeah.
Okay, yes. But then there was another image that
Another space from a mosque in Turkey, which was designed as a space for the royal family. That's right, yes. The Loge, the Sultan's Loge is generally what it's referred to.
Oh, sorry, I confused them. So my question is, where does it come from that in modern mosque design, very often we see that the spaces for women are those elevated balconies? And I remember at one point somebody suggesting that this was an influence from Byzantine churches and cathedrals, but where do you think this comes from in the modern period, when there seems to be this intentional design for women's spaces?
Short answer is I have no idea, because as we've just pointed out, the spaces that some earlier critics like Tammy Gabor suggested were designed for women, the Ottoman upper balconies were more likely just for the royal family. Again, this is a subject that really needs some research. When and where exactly did these spaces begin to proliferate, and were there any specific by the patron by the client on the architect? Whose idea was it in the first place? And how does it develop differently in different parts of the Islamic world? This is research that I haven't done in detail, and as far as I know, nobody else has yet, but it's something we urgently need. I agree.
Questions? I have a comment. This question that you just raised, Amina and Bernard, this burning question really is one that seems to me could be brilliantly addressed using the methodologies and sources and material that we Arabic people do. I mean, this can be gotten at from probably from the Arab, yeah, and literature too.
Well, we might
and
have to involve the history department.
we have our own history
Yeah,
unit
but
as
they
well.
don't cover modern period, they do cover the 20th century.
So, but we do cover modern Arabic literature, for example, and it strikes me that this is the kind of thing that a sort of a departmental team might be able to work on together.
Well, whoever can work on it, I would be delighted to see the results of, for sure, yes.
Questions?
Please.
Very deep discussion of this very important topic. My observation is one thing, that as to the books of Islamic law, we will not find any sort of prohibiting women from coming to the mosques. The hadith was to the effect that لا تمنعوا إماء الله بيوت الله. يعني so that was don't prevent or prohibit mosques for the ladies in a sort of rough translation. But perhaps, first of all, the customs played a very important role in by almost the end of the Umayyad periods. Yani it started first by both of them were together, praying together in the main area of the mosque, without any sort of separation. At the time of, yani I am not quite sure, but at the time of Muawiyah, there was sort of thread or any sort of sign that marks the areas allocated for both of the two sects. Perhaps the traditionists in particular started moving forward to not to allow women to go to the mosque. As you said, this is very important area, and it will have to be thoroughly discussed, pointing out what belongs to the customs, what belongs to the Sunnah, what contribution made by the lawyers in particular, the jurists, and by the traditionalists as well. So we have different groups participated in what we have seen lately, perhaps.
Thank you. Yes, that's certainly a very valid comment. I think you'll find that most of what you say there is very much in agreement with what Marianne Katz writes in her book on women in mosques. And she discusses, I think, many of these sources in great detail, in fact. Thank you. Thank you.
If I may, I have a question. This was, these images are fantastic. I was especially intrigued by the modern buildings. In terms of I think you showed a series of plans from Tammy Gabber, where the male and female sides are shown. And I think you mentioned an Aga Khan award-winning mosque that showed the spaces that were more or less different, the same, equal. Do you have any sense in that building what the kind of view was for the worshipers on either side? Do they have a kind of equal view of the entirety of the Qibla
The
wall?
building in question wasn't an Aga Khan award-winning building because it was built by the Aga Khan, and his own buildings are ineligible for his award. It was the Jamaat Khani, the mosque for his followers, which is actually beside their wonderful new museum in Toronto. There, it's completely equal. I think the women are on one side, the men are on the other side. Noha, maybe, I don't know if you've prayed there. You may be able to tell us if that's the case. No? Okay. But I think, yes, it's women on one side, men on the other. That's where her diagram seemed to indicate, since she has the red for women and the gray for men, and they were two halves in this case.
And the wall is completely solid, separating the two?
There's no wall at all.
Oh, there's no wall at
No,
all?
no wall at all. No, I have been inside it, so I mean, that at least I can confirm from personal observation.
Thank you.
I don't think the mic is on.
In any of the mosques that you showed us, any of them has a separate entrance for women. The reason why I'm asking is that the mosque in Philadelphia, not only do they have a separate space for women, they also have a special entrance.
This is very common. I mean, certainly if there are any separate spaces for women, as in many of the state mosques that I showed you, they have their own, of course, separate entrances to ablutions facilities. It also happens in some others, certainly. That's something that one of the most interesting and important and voluminous sources of information on this is a website designed by one of the British Muslims called Side Door, which tells you more than you need to know about the subject. It's very common, in other words, in mosques in Europe and elsewhere.
Thank you very much, Bernard. It's really fascinating. And I'm embarrassed to say I haven't read this book by Marion Katz, although I have read others, I promise. So, you started out by showing that image from the 60s, that black and white image, right? And I mean, I guess because it's not just you in the room, but it's a lot of other people who know a lot about mosque architecture. So it's kind of a general question, but is the presumption in asking this kind of question, is the presumption that mosque barriers pre-20th century or division of space would have been made from some sort of ephemeral materials that wouldn't have necessarily survived into the 20th century? Or do you think there's an actual shift in practice?
I think it's true. There were some mosque barriers which were made of impermanent materials, sometimes of brick, but Marion Katz mentions these literally described as maqsuras in some cases, so enclosures. But the mosques in which she describes them as having been used nowadays don't have them. They're not visible. So at some later stage, they were totally removed. Does that mean they're removed because women were abolished from the mosque or because they were playing in the back rows? I don't know. But there were some spaces that were set aside, shall we say, earlier, but not permanent ones, it seems.
Just a quick question, please. Do you think this is associated with the withdrawal of the muftiyat, the women muftiyat from the public spaces as well as the muqra'ah? Because in Cairo, there used to be women who would make suhoor and they act as musahharati by reciting Quran from their balconies. And there were women who acted as muftiyat in the mosques, in the different mosques, and women who recited Quran publicly. So am I here, my question is it, this is associated with this, their withdrawal from such a role? Or is associated with with the idea of the mosque being an object of consumption versus a place of consumption?
I think you will know much more about this subject than I do, since you have lived through these changes. I do know certainly that women's participation in life in mosques in Egypt and many other countries in the Muslim world has increased substantially in recent decades. But as to the specifics of how welcome they are as muftis, I can't answer that, but maybe someone else in the orchestra, in the audience who is more familiar with this topic than me. So if anybody else would care to jump in this topic, I would be very interested to hear about it. No?
If not, perhaps we could adjourn to the reception, and people who have some perhaps ideas about how Dr. O'Kane might move his topic forward could share them with him over some snacks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.